Nothing in this podcast or on our website should be construed as medical advice. Consult your healthcare provider for your individual nutritional and medical needs. The information presented is based on our research and is strictly that of the author and not necessarily those of any professional group or other individual.
Hi, I'm Sue Becker from Bread Beckers. Welcome to Sue's Healthy Minutes. I'm so excited you've joined me today, and I hope this episode encourages you and allows you to find the answers you have been praying for the health of you and your family. Today on Sue's Healthy Minutes, my guest is Jennifer Winstead. Her story is absolutely incredible. In fact, in her words, she says, "My story is long, but it is no less than a miracle." So it is long, so I'm going to get started. I am so excited for her to share her truly miraculous story of healing. Jennifer, welcome to Sue's Healthy Minutes. You are truly a walking miracle, and I cannot wait for our listeners to hear your story. Before we dive in, share a little bit about yourself, your family, where you're from, and I believe you're a nurse, right?
Yes, I am. Sue, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be here. This is a dream come true for me. I am a resident of California, Northern California. I've lived in California my whole life. I am a wife and a mother. We are actually a blended family. So between my husband and I, we have 6 children and their 6 spouses, so 12 altogether, and 7 grandchildren. And yes, I am a registered nurse. I have been a nurse. Next year will come up on 40 years of being a registered nurse. Yeah.
That's amazing. And you said how many grandchildren?
7 grands. Yeah. My husband has 4 and I have 3. I have twin grandsons and a granddaughter of my own, and then he has 4. So.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, I guess you've heard about me. We have 9 children and 19 grandchildren. We're actually expecting our 2nd great-grandchild in September.
That's wonderful. We're expecting one as well.
Ooh, that is amazing. You have had quite the health journey, and you shared with me that it actually began back in your teenage years. Let's start there.
When I think about my gut health, that's what's driven most of my health problems is my gut. And when I was in high school and in my early college days, I worked part-time for a dermatologist, and I had a few pimples on my face here and there. I did not have bad acne, but I worked for a dermatologist who was perfectly willing to prescribe anything and everything to make those pimples go away. So he prescribed for probably a couple of years. I was on antibiotics prophylactically to treat acne and was told that that was perfectly safe. And then later on in my college days, when I was working for him, a new medication came out called Accutane, and it was all the rage. And he promised me if I take that medication, I'll never have a pimple again. And he was absolutely right. But of course, he said, we have to monitor your labs while you're on this medication. We have to check your liver. So that should have been a red flag. But my mom and I, we trusted him, and I went on Accutane. And honestly, I have never felt like my gut was the same after that. I've always had, through my 20s and 30s, I would say what I called a cranky bowel. Some people call it irritable bowel, but I called it my cranky bowel, my princess gut. I can even remember when I was 23 years old, I was getting married. It was my wedding day, and my grandma had to pull a low modal out of her purse because I had been in the bathroom too much. So I always had a tendency this way. I was basically a healthy woman in my 20s and 30s, but I leaned this way. If I was under any kind of stress or anxiety, any kind of anything, it would send me to the bathroom. So I think that that's where it started for me.
Yeah. And we just kind of chalk it up to being nervous or just thinking, like you said, oh, it's just cranky. It's just whatever.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I do want to talk to you a little bit about Accutane, being a nurse, what you know about it. I know it was really popular back in the 90s, and I did some research on it back then when I had teenagers and heard of other teenagers using it. Thankfully, mine never needed it, and I wouldn't have gone that route anyway because of what I had learned about the long-term effects. But can you tell us a little bit of what you know about it? Is it still being used today?
It is. This medication is still widely recommended and prescribed by dermatologists. In fact, I think it's considered the gold standard for acne treatment even to this day. I've heard minor side effects such as chronic dry eyes and dry skin. That's what most people complain about. But I've also read that there's a link to inflammatory bowel disease, musculoskeletal issues like prolonged joint pain, permanent damage to the liver. The medical literature, when you look at it, it indicates that long-term consequences are rare. However, there are many people out there like me, so I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence as well. You just can't deny it.
Yeah, yeah. I knew about the sun sensitivity too, because it's basically very, very high doses of vitamin A, right?
Exactly, which can be very toxic.
It can be, and people think, oh, it's just vitamin A. But like I said, I knew about the sun sensitivity and the dry skin and the dry eyes. But the more concerning for me back then when I did my research was the long-term effect it could have even later in life when you weren't even taking it, or maybe while you're still taking it, on the unborn child during pregnancy of the mom who had taken it in, prior years. I did not know about the long-term irritable bowel issues. Do you think your issues were related to the Accutane?
I really do. I think the use of Accutane and taking antibiotics for a couple of years, I think it put me into a state of sort of dysbiosis in my gut. I think my microbiome was off. It was just never the same after that.
Absolutely. So if anybody's listening, parents of teenagers, be warned, this is not necessarily a safe solution to use. And I've heard and had read many stories of the long-term effects of Accutane back when I was researching it. But then clipping along, you got to your 30s and your early 40s, you begin to have the joint pain that I believe you told me was misdiagnosed at that time.
Yeah. So up to that point, I considered myself a pretty healthy person with the occasional, bathroom issues. But in my late 30s and early 40s, I began to experience just a lot of inflammation in my body, a lot of joint pain, and it was just kind of unexplained. And I had a doctor at the time that diagnosed me with fibromyalgia, but it was years later, probably about 15 years later, that I had some blood testing with a rheumatologist and discovered that I actually had some autoimmune diseases. I do think sometimes fibromyalgia can be a little overdiagnosed when someone's in chronic pain and the doctor doesn't know what it is and they don't want to dig deeper. They will slap a diagnosis on you, and that's what they did with me.
Yeah. What autoimmune were you diagnosed with?
I was diagnosed with several, mixed connective tissue disease, which is a mix of lupus, polymyositis, and scleroderma. And then I was diagnosed later with ankylosing spondylitis, which my son also has. That's an autoimmune disease of the joints. Lupus also affects the joints. And then psoriasis, and then, of course, colitis. Yeah.
Wow. And about 10 years ago, 2016, 2017, you started having dental problems on top of all of this. And,
Yes.
this is not fun because there's a lot of information out there that makes dental treatment very concerning. And honestly, we don't know what to do. So share what happened there. What did you decide to do?
Yeah, I had never had problems with my teeth before, but all of a sudden I had this one tooth that just kept giving me problems. And so the doctor ended up doing a root canal on me. It turned out that tooth never needed a root canal. It was a fractured tooth, and that's why it was giving me so much trouble. But this went on for probably a couple of years. They kept opening it up and trying to work on it. And it was just giving me a lot of pain. And also at this time, I had also injured my arm at work. And so I was on some pretty high dose ibuprofen. And towards the end of 2016, they put me on some antibiotics again for that tooth, actually for about a month. And I think the use of the antibiotics and the ibuprofen just really impacted my gut. And one day I woke up with just this horrible, horrible diarrhea. I was very, very sick, but I started bleeding from my rectum. And so I went to the hospital and they admitted me. They did a CT scan. I had never been hospitalized for anything before. And the doctor said, you have a raging colitis. What's going on? Have you traveled out of the country? They put me on isolation just to be safe. They ruled out all kinds of infections. They couldn't find anything. They didn't want to do a colonoscopy at the time because I had had a routine screening colonoscopy just a few years prior to that, and it had turned out normal. So they didn't want to put me through that. They felt it would aggravate my symptoms. So they just treated me with antibiotics, IV antibiotics and steroids, which I probably didn't even need. I also was under a great deal of stress during this time. I was in a very dysfunctional, abusive marriage. I was married to an alcoholic. And so I think the combination of the stress and the tooth and taking the ibuprofen and the antibiotics, I think it was just too much for my gut. They ended up sending me home. Actually, I went home against medical advice. My husband had lost his job at this point, and so I was the breadwinner of the family, and I really felt like I've just got to get home and get back to work. So I had a lot of pressure on me. So I went back home and kind of got things sort of under control. But my gut was never really the same after this. The way that I would manage going to work would be, I would go in a fasting state and either not eat at work or eat very lightly or maybe bring something liquid to drink. And then I would be up all night with diarrhea and load up with Imodium and, ended up divorcing at that time. So it was a really, really hard time.
Wow. I just can't even imagine. My heart just breaks as I hear you say this. And it took several years for you to finally get a diagnosis. But like you said, you were in a pretty pretty debilitating lifestyle at this point, going to the bathroom 25 times a day, completely liquid stools. That's not normal. And then I've heard so many similar stories, people dealing with things like you can't get away from bathroom. They'd say the only way they can leave their home is to simply not eat. And, what kind of life is that? Certainly not a life of health and freedom, but you had some relief. I think you said you were treated with steroids, right?
Yeah. So finally in 2019, this went on for a couple of years. I had just kind of learned how to make it work for myself. But it's like you said, it finally became debilitating. And into 2019, they finally decided, I think this is more than irritable bowel. We need to go in and take a look. So they did a colonoscopy. And this time they took a tissue sample, they took a biopsy, and they got it under a microscope and found out that I had something called microscopic colitis, which is a form of inflammatory bowel disease. And actually, to be honest with you, I was thrilled because I had an answer and maybe a possible treatment. Up until this point, we didn't know what it was. And the doctor told me that there was a good treatment for it. It's a steroid called budesonide, and it's a 90-day course. And he said, you're probably going to respond really well to it. And I did. Within a couple of days of being on this steroid, I had a solid bowel movement and was just feeling so much better. And they told me at the time that there was, a likelihood it could come back. 2 out of 3 people stay in remission, and 1 out of 3 it'll come back. And I just told the doctor, it's not going to come back for me. I was just super positive about it. I said, I just needed a little extra help. So, but it did return. It did return. At this point in my life, I had remarried. Life was looking good. I married a godly man who's just been my rock. He's amazing, and he has supported me through my health journey. So things were looking good, but the colitis did return. In end of 2020, I decided to retire because my symptoms were coming back, and it just felt like too much for me to try to work. And then in 2021, they tried to treat me again. And this time it didn't work as well. They told me that there was a possibility it's not as effective the more you use these steroids. So we also moved into a different home this year and in 2021. And shortly after, about 2 months after the move, I broke out with a horrible rash all over my body from head to toe. I did not have an inch of skin that was not covered other than my face. My face was the only place that was just lightly spotted, but everywhere else, it was everywhere. And they sent me to a dermatologist, and she couldn't even do allergy patch testing on me because there was no healthy skin to test. They ended up sending me to a dermatologist at UC Davis because it was so severe. And she took one look at me and she said, "You have psoriasis." And I was like, psoriasis, where did this come from? And so they treated me with more steroids, lots of prednisone, topical steroids, very strong topical steroids. And I actually ended up going through topical steroid withdrawal, which is almost worse than the psoriasis itself. So just a whole host of side effects. They put me on a biologic, an immunosuppressive called Humira. You may have heard of that before. That did not work. So then they added in some methotrexate, which is basically chemotherapy. That did not work. Also during this year, this is 2022 now, we had between my husband and I, we had 3 sons get married that year and a nephew. And this was a very important year for me and my family. And I almost missed a couple of those events. I actually did have to miss a couple of bridal showers, and it just broke my heart. And in order to attend these weddings, I had to be on very high dose steroids just to try to keep the symptoms under control. They also discovered black mold in our home during this time, which they thought could be driving some of this. So we had to remediate, which was also another stress. And they treated me with some antifungals, which helped me a little bit while I was on them. But as soon as I was off of them, my symptoms came back. And then at the end of 2022, they got me on a new medication called Skyrizi. And the doctor told me, "I think that this is going to take your symptoms away pretty quickly." And I said, "Well, why didn't we try this first?" And she said, "Well, because insurance dictates what we can do, and we have to try and fail these other medications before we can put you on this one." So they put me on Skyrizi, which was also a biologic, and it took my psoriasis away completely. And mind you, it was bad. I mean, the only way I could sleep at night was to pack myself in ice. My body was on fire all the time. And the Skyrizi, honestly, to this day, I'm very thankful for that medication because it kind of saved my life in that moment. I think it took away my psoriasis within 2 days. And so that was finally under control, but at this point, I'm still dealing with my colitis.
Oh, yeah. You're a nurse and you've been in the naturopathic world too, right? And so you started seeing functional doctors and you tried everything.
I sure did. That's right. So at this point, from the time that I was hospitalized, I sort of changed the trajectory of my life, and I started going down a holistic route, which I had never done before. I didn't know anything about it. I got into the hands of a naturopath and a functional medicine doctor. And I also I'm very tenacious and very driven and very type A. And so when I just poured 100% of my time. I was retired. And so I just was going to learn everything I could, listen to every podcast, every research article, everything I could get my hands on. I did the famous ditch and switch where I went through my house and switched out everything toxic for clean, what I use in my home, what I use on my body. I switched out our diet, no seed oils, no sugar, just really cleaned up our lives. Saw these doctors and they had me on every protocol you can imagine, ozone therapy, every herbal you can think of, Western medicine, Eastern medicine, all of it. And honestly, they didn't help me. They actually made me worse. Every time these wonderful doctors who were just trying to help me gave me something, I would end up having a Herxheimer reaction, a detox reaction, and my symptoms would get much, much worse. I had, in addition to the colitis, I had SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and SIFO, fungal overgrowth. And, those can be very, very stubborn. And I wasn't responding to therapy. They did GI map tests on me, and my gut was just so dysbiotic, so messed up. I had a lot of candida, and the bad guys were outweighing the good guys in my gut. And they just could not find anything that would work for me. And honestly, I was just getting worse.
My goodness. And in your words, you said, I was a very, very, very sick girl. until bread. But you even commented that January and February of 2025, is that right?
Yes, yes.
Were some of your worst months. What was going on then?
You know what? No, it really did progress, and it got to the point where the diarrhea was all day and all night, and I was housebound for the most part. I would have to plan my trips very carefully in a fasting state. I would load up on Imodium. I mean, I would take a box of Imodium. It was just, and not that that really helped, but it sort of kept things under control. And I just learned how to sort of manage it as best I could. I had lost about a third of my hair at this point. I had lost a lot of weight. It was becoming unbearable, but I discovered something in the end of 24 and the end of into 25, and it was a new relationship with Jesus that I hadn't experienced before.
Yeah.
I had been a believer my whole life, and I've loved the Lord my whole life. But I think being as sick as I was caused me to press in with him on a level that I had never done before. Mm-hmm. And I began to experience this peace that I've never experienced before. And Sue, it just really didn't make sense to be that sick, but to have that much peace and that much joy. And only our Father can do that. Yeah. And I like to mention this to people because there are different pillars to health. You know, there's so many wonderful things we can do. There's movement and exercise and food and all these amazing things. But if you don't have peace in your body and in your life, if your nervous system is wrecked like mine was, and if you're in constantly a state of fight or flight, I think that can be a real barrier to getting well. And this was a pivotal moment for me. This came right before the bread. And I think it's very important to mention this because this had to happen for me first. God had to heal some deep wounds and deep traumas that were in me that I didn't realize were there. And he brought me into this place of rest and digest that I needed so badly. I can even remember one day I was on a hike. We live in the mountains and we have these beautiful trails out behind our house. And I always made it a priority to take my prayer walks even when I was sick. And so I would just plan accordingly. I wouldn't eat, and I would take my hike. And there was this one day, in spite of doing all that, I was on my way back and I had about 15 minutes left of my hike. And I had the urge to go to the bathroom, and I was in pain and cramping and urgent and trying to run back home. And all the while, I felt his presence over me, and I felt this peace and this joy. And I thought, wow, this is how I know I'm in the right place with the Lord, because it didn't make sense that I would feel that kind of peace and be that sick. And during that time, he began to speak to me during these moments of peace and rest with him. He began to speak to me about bread. And I was getting really good at hearing from him. And I was like, God, why do you keep speaking to me about bread? What is it? Do you want me to take communion? Like, what are you talking about here? Because bread was my enemy. I mean, Sue, I had not had bread in probably close to 7, 8 years at that point.
Right.
Not even gluten-free. I mean, crackers, nothing. And I didn't even crave it anymore. I didn't even want it. I was so used to not having it, and it made me so sick. It didn't really make sense to me, but I kept hearing him talk to me about bread.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And you had tried so many other diets, all the popular ones, the keto, the low FODMAP, the paleo, all of those things. And you were eating clean, but again, you were on a very restrictive diet. And I love that you said God kept telling you to stop fearing food.
Yes, ma'am.
That's what I am seeing so much. And for the last few years, God has really given me the words food freedom. I hear so many stories of people limited to just a few foods they can tolerate. I interviewed a young couple last week, and the husband, 4 foods. How can you live on 4 foods? But they get that way like you. You have these adverse reactions, and that's all you know to do. And then they've become fearful of food. Understandably so. But that is not a way to live. So you started looking into bread. You mentioned that the gluten-free products hadn't really agreed with you, so you just stopped eating any kind of bread and even stopped craving it. But through this spiritual journey, God brought those cravings back. So, like so many people, you jumped on the sourdough bandwagon along with everyone else.
Yes, ma'am, I sure did. So, yeah, just everything that you just said. I tried every diet. I tried the GAPS diet, the Lion diet, the carnivore diet. I tried low FODMAP. And, none of these diets helped me. But I will say I learned through these diets that there were certain foods that definitely made me worse, and I learned to stay away from them. So I was down to just a few foods like rice and chicken, very bland, boring diet, still very sick, but I at least learned what I could eat reasonably. But yeah, I jumped on the sourdough wagon because everybody and their brother was making sourdough, and God was talking to me about bread, and I didn't know what else to do. And my goddaughter, she made bread, she made sourdough bread, and she had some how-to videos. So I watched those and I said, okay, I think I can do that. Sue, I have always loved to cook. I have always loved to bake. I can even remember when I was in high school, I would come home from school and I would get my mom's old Betty Crocker cookbook out. I would look in there for some recipe that I'd never heard of before, like a spinach souffle, and I would make that thing, and my mom would come home from work and there'd be a souffle in the oven. So I've always been that person, and I love to bake, baking even more so. My favorite way to show love to my coworkers at the hospital was to bring fresh homemade scones, and my sons love to cook. That's our favorite way to spend time together, is in the kitchen. I love to bake with my granddaughter. So God's talking to me about bread, and it's a no-brainer. I said, oh, absolutely, I'll bake. That's fine. I miss baking. So I went to Costco and I got some organic, unbleached flour, which I thought was the perfect choice. And I made some sourdough and I ate it, and I didn't feel good. I didn't feel good at all. And so I talked to my son about it. At this time, he was getting ready to open up his own bakery, and he was very knowledgeable. And I asked him about it, and he said, Mom, maybe you need to try some ancient grains like spelt or einkorn. And I had never even heard of these. But I did that. He said they might be more digestible. So I got some organic spelt and some organic einkorn and made some more sourdough. And I still didn't feel good. I was excited to be able to have a piece of bread. It was delicious, but I could just tell my body was so inflamed, and my gut, it was wreaking havoc on my gut. So I probably only did that for a couple of months. I kept hearing the Lord say, you're on the right track, but you're not there yet.
I love that. Be sure to listen next week to hear the rest of Jennifer's journey to find health from whole grains and real bread made from freshly milled flour. Until next time, this is Sue Becker from Bread Beckers with Sue's Healthy Minutes.
Sue's Healthy Minutes podcast has been a presentation by the Bread Beckers Incorporated, located in Woodstock, Georgia. For more information, store hours, and learning opportunities, visit breadbeckers.com and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast and never miss an episode. Share this with 2 friends who would benefit from this information, and be sure to join us again next week for more of Sue's Healthy Minutes.